And now it is, I hope and trust, my great pleasure to welcome to the stage His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's accompanied by his interpreter, Geshe La. I'd now like to invite Lynette Russell onto the stage to provide an acknowledgement of country on behalf of the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. Lynette Russell.
It is a custom across Australia that at events such as this we are welcomed onto the country by an elder or traditional owner. In this absence, it is appropriate that we offer an acknowledgement of country. I've been asked by the elders of the Wurundjeri to do this today on their behalf. It is therefore my great privilege to observe that in this spirit of reconciliation, Monash University recognises it is situated on the country for which the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations have been traditional owners and custodians for thousands of years. It is on the land that we stand today that the ancestors and elders performed age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. I'm proud to be able to acknowledge our living culture and unique role in the life of this region, and I offer deep appreciation and respect for elders past, present and future. On behalf of the Aboriginal people in the audience, Your Holiness, I would like to offer you this gift.
Thank you, Lynette. And it is now my great pleasure and my great honour to invite His Holiness the Dalai Lama to give the keynote address on the middle way, a peaceful approach to resolving conflict. Please.
Dear brothers and sisters, although my visit, I think practically everywhere, non-political nature, and then my main sort of interest or commitment is promotion of human value. That I consider key factor, happy life, individual level, family level, community level. In modern time, seems not sufficient to pay attention about these inner value. So that's my number one commitment. And then number two, promotion of religious harmony. So these two are my main sort of interest, or main commitment. The third, being as a Tibetan, and with the name of Dalai Lama, and more important, the Tibetan people, inside as well as outside, particularly inside Tibet, they really put a lot of hopes and trust and expectation. Therefore, I have the moral responsibility about serve to them. So, anyway, some people consider this is something political matter. So, except my visit Washington and Brussels, usually not sort of carrying the political discussions mainly. But now here, our supporters and also the concern of our friends is the one to listen about my midwave approach regarding the Tibetan issue. Then firstly, firstly, I want to explain the very nature of Tibetan problem. Firstly, Tibet, geographically, people call roof of the world. And also land of snowland. As a result, major rivers which cover Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and also like Mekong River and Yellow River. So the vast Asian continent covers these big rivers. The original source come from Tibet. So therefore, Tibet issue. Also, one aspect of Tibet issue is preservation or protection of environment. Since 60s, large scale of deforestations took place. As a result, in the recent years, what's called? Unprecedented. I don't know. The proper announcement, I don't know.
Unprecedented.
Unprecedented sort of flood in China proper, as well as Bangladesh and India. According experts, these unusual flood is a connection with the large scale of deforestation inside Tibet. So fortunately, since some time back, this Chinese central government used to take some sort of also restrictions. However, through corruptions, through some connection, some Chinese who simply making money, they also found ways and means to still carry some cutting trees like that. Then exploring, the minerals, natural resources. Of course, worthwhile, use natural resources, but should be careful plan without much damage about environment. That's lacking. So the one aspect of Tibetan issue is environment issue. That not only concern for 6 million Tibetan people, but I think whole northern India, you see, their life very much depends on these major rivers. So already scarcity of water already now facing, as well as in China proper. So therefore, the concerning about environment issue of Tibet is very much connected with millions of people in that continent, in that area. Of course, you Australian, no relevant about Tibetan rivers. You are completely independent. But you have your own problems, isn't it? A lot of drought or something like that, isn't it? So the global warming, while global warming, I think no force can stop that. So with that situation, I think we really need a special pay attention, special care about environment of that part of the world. That's number one. Number two, Tibetan culture. Usually I describe Tibetan culture is basically Buddhist culture. So I make distinctions. I usually make distinctions: Buddhism and Buddhist culture. Buddhist culture means related with society. Buddhism as a religion related with the individual. So, among Tibetan, there are Muslims, there are Christians. Since early part of 20th century, some Christians also there. Muslim at least last 400 years in Tibet. But their lifestyle very much in the spirit of Buddhist culture. If you visit Srinagar in Kashmir, some small group, Tibetan Muslim. So in their lifestyle, furnitures in their house, very much Tibetan-like, Tibetan sort of, Tibetan way. And their expressions also, you see, very similar that of Buddhist. So therefore, the culture, Buddhist culture, I feel, as a result of seeing many trouble in this planet due to small incident, bloodshed, the suffering of innocent people in many areas. It happened. Look in Africa and Middle East. So when we are seeing these things, then it begin to realize Tibetan Buddhist culture really create peaceful society. Of course, that does not mean some Tibetans are very cruel, merciless, fighting, killing. But overall, I think situation, I think Tibetan community, I think comparatively much compassionate. So that culture heritage is really worthwhile to preserve. And for preservation of Tibetan culture, this Buddhist culture, naturally very much related with the Buddha Dharma, Buddhism, Buddhist tradition. So, almost 5-6 decades, a lot of damage, a lot of destructions. Still, a lot of restrictions inside Tibet. So that's one aspect of the problem. Then with that, human rights violations. Naturally, Tibetan loves their own culture, their own spirituality, Buddhism. Then someone carry a lot of restrictions, then naturally, and also destructions. Just a few days ago, I heard there is some statue which recently built with help of one Chinese rich family. That statue in Samye Monastery, I heard that destroyed with sort of heavy military personnel. Just I think 1 week ago, about 1 week ago, like that. Therefore, the Tibetan naturally very much resented. According Tibetan, who Communist Party member since last 30-40 years, and who worked in various different Chinese departments. So according to these people, 90% of Tibetan people are very much resented about the current sort of situation. As a result, of course, direct opposition is very, very difficult, but indirectly, some kind of sort of opposition. So then, immediately arrest and a lot of torture. Case, murder, stealing, very lenient. Political, so-called political, actually Tibetan expression of concern about their own future, about their own culture, that's crime. So, as a result, the arrest and torture, just a few days ago, before leaving Australia, I think I left Dharamsala 4th. 3rd, I met some Tibetan who recently come from Tibet. And among them, one Tibetan prisoner who spent about 10 years in Chinese prison. He personally sort of experienced a lot of torture. And one of his companions died in the prison. So, because of that sort of situation, because of that kind of repression, the human rights violation also very serious. That's one aspect of the problem. Then politically, geographically, Tibet between mainland China and India. In the past, Tibet acted as a buffer zone. Since 1959, that situation changed. And as a result, 1962 war, Sino-Indian War happened. As a result, both sides, the thousands military stationed in that difficult border. So both nations very much need economic development. So station large number of soldiers in both sides of the border is actually very harmful for their economy. I often tell my Indian friends, and also many Indian friends told me, the amount of money which spent on the so-called defense of northern border. That amount of same money, if used for hospital or schools in India, I think a lot of hospitals, a lot of schools can build. So anyway, really, extra unnecessary burden in economic field. Then, since India and China, two most populated nations, so genuine friendship on the basis of mutual trust is very essential. So for that reason, Tibet issue somehow involved. So long Tibetan people, unhappy mental state. As a result, Chinese government have to station large number of soldiers and security personnel. So long, large number of military presence there. The Indian side also, they under smile, diplomatic smile, underneath some suspicions, some anxieties, naturally there. Therefore, genuine normality, where I think normality in that area is very essential in order to develop genuine friendship between India and China on the basis of mutual trust. So these are the aspects of Tibetan issue. So now, whether Chinese government admit or not, there is a problem. I think every visitors, I think those visitors who, because of high altitude, some headache or some
altitude sickness.
Altitude sickness, they may not notice much. But those people who are more serious and more healthy, everybody knows, sees the situation tense. Some kind of war between Tibetan and Chinese. Some Chinese officials now accuse me, and Dalai Lama is exaggerating, exaggerating tension between races. But actually, all this information, not my creation, but these information come from Tibet. So those who are Tibetan, I think now more than 20 years, there's a new opportunity coming Tibetan from Tibet, and also Tibetan visit in their own homeland. So through these people, we got the clear picture. So the information is among the officials or cadres in different departments, including Chinese, the Liberation Army, the Tibetan, Han Chinese, and some other minorities. Between them, some kind of war, Han, Chinese, and Tibetan. Then, in school, student, also there is gap. There's a distance. Among the ordinary people, also is some kind of barriers. And among the prisoners, among the beggars, as a result of railway link established. At the beginning, some guests, some visitors, some wealthier visitors, some pilgrimage, right? Pilgrims, some Chinese used to come as pilgrims. And then eventually, some beggars, and also Shangzhou prostitute. So this number is increasing. So even among the beggars, sometimes little barrier like that. So this, I'm telling, is my Chinese friend. Always I telling them, before 1959, although we sometimes we see criticize, complain, and suspicion towards policy, never as Chinese. Since the 7th centuries, 8th centuries, we have long history, close connection with Chinese, with Indians. In fact, I usually used to describe our relation with Indians is something like teacher and student. We are Buddhist. All our Buddhist tradition translated from India. And many Indian masters has come to Tibet. And also many Tibetan students through many centuries went to India to study. So we have, like that, this is very special sort of relations. And also with Chinese. So therefore, you see, in our mind, very close friend. Now, after 59, now that kind of new sort of some form of racial problems is very unfortunate. We have to live side by side. Then this kind of sort of distrust is very bad for both. So therefore, this is problem. This is seed of problem. So we have to find ways and means to solve this problem. Now I always use the word we, because since last 6 years, we already have elected political leadership. So actually, as early as 1969, one of my formal statement I made clear, the very institution of Dalai Lama should continue or not up to Tibetan people. Then also as early as 1963, we adopted one draft constitution. There, one clause mentioned the Dalai Lama's power can abolished by 2/3 of the majority of the assembly.
People's deputies.
A people's deputy, like that. So, 1959 April, we came to India, become refugee. And in 1960, we at once committed promotion of democracy. Now, about 6 years ago, around 2000, we achieved elected political leadership. So since then, my position is something like semi-retired position. So, I'm acting like advisor or senior advisor. But in practical as well as theoretical, the real decision in his hand, the elected political leadership's hand, and not my hand. So that's true. We voluntarily, happily, now promoting democracy, democratic practice. So our approach, from thinking from various viewpoints. Now, as early as 1974, China, then still in the Cultural Revolution sort of confusion or movement. Dharamsala, we through discussion, we made up in our mind. Sooner or later, we have to talk with the Chinese government. So then, the question of independence is not practical. And also, if you look from wider perspective, the small community, small nation, such as Tibet, economically, is our own interest. Join with bigger community. Instead of 6 million separation, better join 1,000 millions. So that's our sort of, our vision, our view. So, in '74, we made up in our mind, in future, whenever we have opportunity to talk with Chinese government, then not seeking independence, but to achieve meaningful autonomy. So then, '79, the Chinese then leadership, Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yanpang, so their side, some indication, they want talk with us. So as soon as that indication come, we at once, oh, very good, now we are ready to talk. So since then, the direct contact with Chinese government started. In early '80s, there was real hope. The Deng Xiaoping there, Hu Yanpang there, the Hu Yanpang, I think '80, visit Lhasa. He publicly admit past mistake. A communist leader publicly admit their mistake is very, very rare. Isn't it? The communist policy or totalitarian policy always right. But he, very unusual, sort of practical, pragmatic way. Deng Xiaoping leadership, very pragmatic, and Hu Yanpang seems very practical. So he publicly mentioned, and also he promised the large number of Han Chinese will withdraw. I think he mentioned, 70% or 80% will withdraw, he mentioned publicly. So, at that time, real hope. So my personal emissary has met Deng Xiaoping, I think early '79. And he mentioned, besides question of independence, anything can be discussed. So he mentioned, so our side also, since '74, we already made up in our mind. So there's no problem. So we immediately start talk with Chinese concerned government, concerned department, like that. Then '83, I express, I want to visit Tibet to see by myself and also try to reconcile. But then around that is actually my sort of original plan. I expressed '83 that desire. In '84, I want to send a delegation, make preparation, because as a past experience, when my first delegation and second delegation visit Tibet, the public sort of mopping way, so including those so-called revolutionary sort of during Cultural Revolution, more advanced or more revolutionary-minded sort of people, they come first batch to greet my delegation. So mopping. So if my visit creates that kind of sort of unrest, it's no good. Therefore, we need careful preparation. So therefore, 84, I want to send a delegation, make preparation about my visit, advise Tibetan should not do that kind of thing. Then that, the Chinese government not permit that delegation. Then suppose 85, that visit planned, but then have to cancel. Then 80, 86, 87, Huang himself disgraced. And freedom movement or democratic movement from many universities started, I think, 86 or 87. Then finally, 89, Tiananmen massacre happened. So whole policy became more hardened. So our contact with Chinese government then became difficult. But officially, still we have some communication. Then 93, completely stopped, completely ceased that contact. But then, beginning of 2000, through some Chinese businessman or some individual Chinese initiative, eventually we renewed direct contact with the Chinese government. So, up to now, 5 meetings, what called round table talks with Chinese officials took place. So the meeting itself, or atmosphere, from first, second, third, fourth, fifth, improved, more cordial, more frank discussions. Discussion itself seems useful, some progress. But then unfortunately, the situation inside Tibet, as a result of replacement of party secretary, now policy inside Tibet hardened, suppression much increased, restrictions much increased. So including shooting at border, Nepal border, one innocent person killed, few people injured, some young student arrested, like that. So that worldwide people, worldwide, knows that. So, but still, so our approach, usually we call middle way, not present the so-called autonomy inside Tibet. Autonomy is meaningless. Every decisions in the hands of Han Chinese, who have no idea about Tibetan culture, about Tibetan environment, or everything about Tibet. They don't know. Their only sort of concern is Tibet might separate. That's the only concern. So therefore, one previous party secretary, another hardliner thinking, he at public party meeting, he mentioned the source of Tibetan, danger of Tibetan separation from China is Tibetan Buddhist faith. So it is, I think, it's a wrong view. Many Buddhists in Chinese, among the Chinese, nowadays, I think around 1 million Chinese already following Tibetan Buddhism. That's not danger of separation. So treated well Tibetan, respect Tibetan culture, Tibetan Buddhism, it gives some sort of, happier feeling among Tibetans, isn't it? So therefore, those Chinese, they really look all aspects of Tibet is something dangerous or something backward, and therefore they don't bother about these things. So that's why you see, it creates a lot of sadness, a lot of resentment among Tibetans, like that. So the present is a policy is really not helpful to solve this problem. Then, other hand, independence. That also, as I mentioned earlier, emotionally, yes, many young Tibetans, including youth organizations, they are very critical about our approach. They also criticize about me. They consider very weak Dalai Lama. So since 6 years, and also since 6 years, I made very clear, they choose whatever you want. You disagree with our approach, absolutely right, absolutely okay. We fully committed about democracy, so any criticism, most welcome. However, you should make, systematic sort of program. If you really want independence, and how to achieve. Not easy. So I respond to their criticism, I usually tell them like that. So if they made some kind of realistic, practical proposal, then majority of Tibetan people will support them. Okay. So that's the way change of our government or exile government. Recently, I received some letter from some Tibetan youth. They expressed to me, since they lost their faith, so I should dissolve our exile parliament as well as exile government. So we do not want that way. I do not want to follow Nepalese kings' sort of behavior, just to dissolve. No, certainly not. If they really, as they lost their trust, the true election will change. That's the way. So like that. So our middle way is not seeking independence, not the present sort of condition. So some meaningful autonomy, which Constitution of People's Republic of China is provided. Now that right should implement sincerely, fully, on the spot. So that's the main meaning of middle-way approach. So, I think finish. So some questions. I think basically, you see, our approach is actually mutual benefit. Theoretically speaking, mutually agreeable solution. At practical level, the present Chinese president, Hu Jintao, very much emphasis on the importance of harmony. So our proposal is best way to achieve harmony and stability and unity. Thank you.
I'll now invite each of our panellists to give a brief response to the Dalai Lama's speech. First of all, Colin Mackerras.
Good afternoon. I agreed with a great deal of what you said, Your Holiness, and I share your wish for harmony. I share your wish for your emphasis on the environment, and I also share your wish for more autonomy and for the guarantee of Tibetan culture. I've been to Tibet 4 times and to Tibetan areas of China 4 times. And I've come to love the place. I love Tibetan culture and I love the Tibetan people. I want to be more positive than you on one respect, and also to raise a question, which I think is a very important one. On the positive side, I see in my visits to Tibet, I've seen a lot of evidence that the Tibetan livelihood, the lifestyle, and the Tibetan Buddhist culture is very much alive. Every Tibetan I've spoken to almost every Tibetan I've spoken to has expressed a belief in Tibetan Buddhism. Every Tibetan house I've been into, and I've been into a fair few, has a shrine. The number of Tibetans in the clerical order is still quite large.
Oh yes, so.
And you said in your talk that it was a crime to for Tibetans to promote their own culture. I think it's a crime for them to use Tibetan culture to promote separatism, but I don't see the signs that it's a crime to promote their own culture. All the Tibetans I've spoken to love their culture. And last year, I attended a conference in Beijing which had the specific aim of promoting Tibetan culture. Now, the question I want to raise, you talked about Tibet, and of course that's good. But I have a question: what is Tibet? There are two Tibets in a way. One is the political Tibet, which is the same as the Tibet Autonomous Region, and the other is Amdo and Kham included, the three provinces of what you regard as Tibet, but which are now parts of Chinese provinces, especially Qinghai and quite a bit of Sichuan, Yunnan and Gansu. In talking about negotiations with China, which Tibet have you in mind? Because I think that the Chinese will have a very, very different attitude towards granting the kind of autonomy you're talking about in Qinghai and those provinces than they will in Tibet itself. And I think that that's an important question.
No.
That's all I have to say for the time being.
So, if we are seeking independence or separation, then of course, before 1950, the today's autonomy region of Tibet is, according, I think, international legal sort of expert at that time, International Commission of Jurists, say, according to them, and also some other legal expert, they say at that time Tibet was de facto independence. So the government of India also recognized that. So they if we seeking independence, then we have to talk only that part of Tibet. But since we are not seeking independence, we simply concern preservation of Tibetan culture within the People's Republic of China. And also, I myself come from Amdo. Strictly speaking, I'm not a Tibetan. So in last 1,000 years, Tibetan culture, Tibetan spirit built entire 6 million Tibetans, not only the area under Tibetan government jurisdictions before 1950.
So the bottom line is...
So therefore, Tibetan, inside Tibet, the entire Tibetan, they are very much concerned about their own culture, including their own language. So therefore, we are acting here as a free spokesman for Tibetan people. So we have to act according to their wish. If Tibetan, inside Tibet, no desire, they sort of as a one entity, we immediately drop that. So long their desire insist, since the Chinese constitution provide autonomy, different autonomy status. For example, Tibetan area, autonomous region of Tibet, the political Tibet area, Tibetan autonomies of region. Then in Yunnan, Sichuan, Gansu, Qinghai, every Tibetan community, ethnic Tibetan groups, autonomous prefecture, autonomous district, autonomous county, like that. So instead of autonomy, variety of autonomy, maybe practically, maybe easier, make one autonomy. So that's our thinking. That's the best to preserve their culture, their language. And also, I think the best way to give satisfaction to 6 million Tibetan people. So therefore, we have courage. We are not seeking independence. In the past, some Mongolian group, put in the autonomous region of Mongolia. And it is quite practical. It is possible. You see, within one country, this ethnic group, as far as administration is concerned, you see, join with this. This should join this. There's no danger, isn't it?
Okay,
So therefore, you see, we are asking the Chinese government, please treat entire Tibetan as one entity, like that. But the Chinese officials, many officials, very much suspicion about it. I think outside world, well known, Dalai Lama is not seeking independence. But Chinese officials still accuse me continuously. Dalai Lama is seeking independence, like that. Right. Now, which is truth, I don't know.
Here's Ackerman. Would you like to make a comment and a question?
Your Holiness, I think that your summation of the situation, the historical narrative, was absolutely correct, of course. But what concerns me very much now is, given the extraordinary enthusiastic the expansion of the Chinese economically,
yes,
how do you manage to get the Chinese leadership to give any consideration at all to the Tibetan issue, which is such a minor issue in the enormity of the issues that they have to struggle?
Right.
The question of their own population and the question of the gulf that they have between the productive people who are employed now in these mushrooming capitals and their provinces. How do you put Tibet back onto the front burner, particularly as you have the issue with Nepal, where Nepal now has a Maoist government and so forth, and Tibet is not really even an important border issue any longer.
It is true, as I mentioned earlier. Welfare of over billion human beings, over 1,000 millions. 6 million is just, I'll say, very minor. True. But geographically, these three autonomous regions, Inner Mongolia,
Yes.
Xinjiang autonomy, Tibet autonomy, geographically large area. You see, they include all Kasota. I said these three autonomous regions, you see, cover
geographically. Geographically.
And also the very rich minerals, including oil. And also politically, Tibet issue is sensitive. Also, the Tibet issue is very much related with improvement of Sino-Indian relations. So therefore, in China, there is sort of what now is a saying, Inner Mongolian autonomy even ask money from the central government, sometimes refuse. Xinjiang autonomy, whatever they ask, they get money. Tibetan autonomy, without ask, get money. Why? Because of sensitivity. So then another aspect, Tibet, we are very much willing to remain within the People's Republic of China. So therefore, central government morally, practically have to take care about people who are willing to remain within the People's Republic of China if they respect them. So it is national interest, Maria. Right? So in early or mid-50s, when I was in China, mainland China, at least 5 months I spent in Peking itself. So during that period, I met several occasions, Chairman Mao, and all leaders, particularly Chairman Mao, I think at least 10, 15 times. So once she told me, Tibet in the past, quite well sort of nation. Now you become weak. So we, Han Chinese, now sent there to help you. In future, 20 years, 30 years, you may raise, you may develop. Then it is your turn to help us. Then another occasion, long table, I sit one side, Chairman Mao sit one other side, then 2 Chinese generals sit here. Then Chairman Mao pointing these 2 generals. I sent these generals in order to help you. In case these generals do not listen to your view, let me know, I will withdraw. Another occasion, Chairman Mao asked me about a Tibetan flag. He inquired me whether there is flag or not. I responded with a little hesitation. I said, yes. Then he told me, must keep beside the national flag. So I often telling our supporter groups in Europe as well as America, occasionally they Tibetan sort of flag they put. So local Chinese officials always protest. So then I told, doesn't matter, those local Chinese officials protested to you, but I got the permission from Mao Zedong himself. So then, 56, uprising already happened inside Tibet. During that, another word, I think I want to share with you. 1954 autumn, I went to China. And summer 1955, I returned, same road. On the road, I met Zhang Guohua, general, who stationed in Tibet. Shibajin Silian. So on the road, we met. I told him, last year, when I come in this road to Peking, I have suspicion, doubt. Now I'm returning, same road, full of confidence, full of respect, admiration about the revolution. And because since then, I become Marxist. Still, I describe in many places in America, in Europe, in Latin America, I describe myself as a half Marxist, half Buddhist. I think as far as ideology is concerned, I am more communist rather than these Chinese present leaders. Their main concern is economy and power. Of course, their rigid system is concerned, I totally against. The suppression, information, freedom, I totally against. But as far as socio-economy theory is concerned, I'm still Marxist. So at that time, so much attraction about Marxism, and also towards Chairman Mao. I fully sort of trust, I really sort of admire their dedication to the people, particularly to the working class people, and their vision, worldwide revolution in the benefit or liberation of the working class people. So I fully agree that. So one of my sort of theme, global sense of universal responsibility. I think many of you, some of you may know. This sense of universal responsibility comes from Marxist international movement. So if here some anti-communist here, then think me a dangerous person.
Keith Suter, would you like to ask a question of His Holiness?
Yes, Your Holiness, I very much enjoyed the presentation. A comment and a question, sir. The comment is that, following on from what Professor Mackerras had to say, the discussion about there being two Tibets, I think there's a third Tibet, and it is a Tibet of the mind. And even though the Tibetan people are small in number, they have a huge international following.
In the world, following, sorry.
A large number of supporters from all walks of life overseas. So although the numbers are small, I think the influence is very great. In an Australian expression, sir, you are punching above your weight, if Buddhists are allowed to punch. So although, sir, you are small in number, I think that you do attract a huge degree of support. And even here in Australia, Buddhism is one of the fastest growing religions. So there is, as I say, this third Tibet, which is a large number of people who are out there supporting you, even though the number of Tibetans is fairly small in number. That's my comment. My question is, sir, going back to your opening remarks about Tibet as the roof of the world, the land of snow, to what extent are your people monitoring the impact of climate change on Tibet, and particularly the melting of the snows?
I think I also want to make a comment. You know, some Chinese professors who really very, very patriotic Chinese. So they say the Chinese ambition is become superpower. It is true. It is deserved. Most populated nation, ancient nation, I think compare Australian, I think Chinese nations are much, much older. So really, the old nation, rich cultural heritage, now economically, so China become influential nation or member of the country in this planet is really deserved. Now, in order to become superpower, according to these Chinese scholars, patriotic sort of Chinese scholars, they say population, that already there. Second, military power, that also there, including nuclear weapons. Third, economic power. Now, since Deng Xiaoping's sort of policy, as a result, now economic power, everybody knows, really now, progress, really remarkably. Now, third factor is moral authority in order to become superpower. America, of course, in spite of some mistake here and there, basically, America as a champion of democracy, liberty, freedom. That's a moral authority. I think American sort of system, the houses, the judiciary, the administration, truly independence. Not like parliamentary sort of government, right? So really, I love America. Very good. And American people, sometimes they too much excited. Little positive things happen there, like that. Little sad things happen, go like that. That's, I think, I may express more childish. So the few occasions you see telling American friends, oh, you don't do that. You see, you're a big nation. You see, should be some good things happen. Should be calm. Bad things happen. Should be calm and gently should handle like that. So I love America. I think Australian, I think more or less, I think British sort of as a tradition. So when I talk with the Englishmen, and not much smile. So in any way, in order to become superpower, the moral authority is very essential. For that is lacking now, China. So Tibetan issue is one place where image of China overnight can change. Clear. And also Tibet issue wisely solve, practically solve, the signal to Taiwanese immense. So reunification with Taiwan. For that reason, positive impact. Then also some kind of mental liberation in around 6 million Chinese in Hong Kong. Well, at the moment so far, a little bit sort of anxious way. So for that also, I think once they solve practically, sensibly about Tibet problem, then international sort of image change, the positive signal to the Hong Kong people and ultimately Taiwanese. And then, as I mentioned before, this relation between India and China improved immensely. So from wider perspective, Tibet issue is not. So now in response to your sort of comment, isn't it? So the Tibet issue, it's something quite sort of, quite useful if solved, you see, properly. So then, now your question.
About global warming.
Oh yes,
climate change.
Tibetans themselves sort of, 'Cause 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 I think Tibetan, firstly, see, for example, myself, before 1950, before 59, or even before early 60s, I have no idea about ecology problems. So I think the rest of Tibetan, no concern, no sort of idea about the importance of ecology. Sometimes, you see, we do recognize some of these snow mountain now melting. So sometimes they believe, or due to some deities, due to some, the local spirit, like that. So otherwise, you see, I think very, very few. Then since 59, I think one of the mistake by the Chinese central government is they totally neglected about training of Tibetan. Give proper education. The only sort of political indoctrination, not proper sort of education. That I think they are their mistake. Whereas outside Tibet, as a refugee community, since 1960, we take full care about education. So now today, education standard among Tibetan refugee community is much better than Tibetans inside Tibet. So that's, I think, the Chinese, one mistake. So as a result, I think expert on including ecology, these things, I think very, very few, very few. Of course, some Chinese, including some NGO, very sincere, very sort of dedicated. I met some. So people, and also some expert from outside, also you see, occasionally you see visit. So these are helping. So still, I think we need the thorough sort of research work on the spot is, I think, very necessary and very important.
Professor Vichen Go, if you'd like to ask a question.
Your Holiness, I'm a great fan of yours. I'm an international law lawyer, and I think your ideas about principles of universal responsibility, compassion, the middle way, they are making inroads into international law. And I think...
Yes.
Yes, and particularly your idea of the middle way in the Sino-Tibetan situation will provide the breakthrough, the realistic breakthrough, because with what we see now in the world, it is not state sovereignty that is important. It is actually some self-governance, some autonomy, and in your own 1988 Strasbourg proposal, you used the example, in fact, of the European community, which is...
European community. That's right.
Yes.
That's model, really. I always refer, you see, European Union. In the previous century, or early part of 20th century, I think small states, they are very much concerned about their own sovereignty or these things. Now, later part of 20th century, now people, I think, becoming more wiser, you see, think or concern about common interest. So they are willing to join bigger community. So European community, it's really wonderful. And also, you see, each individuals, I think, except the Swiss, I think still, the Swiss franc, I think, still using in England, isn't it? But the rest of most of the European, you see, member of the state, you see, they accept the euro rather than their own. I think Italy, the lira, useless. So I think they replace euro much better. So as a result of what's the unified sort of money, euro. Now euro can compete with dollar, isn't it? So the unified is always, you see, because of that, useful. Even from the viewpoint of national interest, it's better to join, work together. Meantime, within this union, each one have their own right. That's very beautiful.
Yes. Yeah, Your Holiness, I think more than Buddhism, the greatest contribution that Tibetan Buddhism is making to the world now is peace, mental technology, that I will call it, and perhaps as we are looking at the middle way, we should also cover a common ground. And with a common ground approach in a dialogue with the Chinese government, perhaps that should be a way in which we can then find ways and means to achieve that goal, particularly in light of the fact that Buddhism is part of ancient wisdoms of the Chinese. So I think we can cover common ground, and I'm wondering, in terms of future dialogues, would you see dialogues going on how Tibet can contribute in terms of the mental technology, which is peace-seeking, not just the Sino-Tibetan situation, but also a global concern? Thank you.
Yes, as I mentioned before, Tibetan Buddhist cultural heritage, the very nature is peaceful, non-violence, compassionate. So that, to some extent, I think entire humanity, I think we can sort of, how to say, rather, it is, we can make some kind of, say, contribution. So as far as Chinese is concerned, now China, as I mentioned before, with long history and sophisticated cultural heritage, say, including Confucianism, very rich, and family sort of what's the day? I think family level, or I don't know, in the family, and also the younger people respect elder, educated, isn't it? So that rich culture in 18th century, 19th century, and the 20th century, also politically, China united, and no longer Western sort of colonial sort of, what's the day? Western exploitation. However, I think due to short-sightedness, great damage about family values, and also the 5,000-year-old Chinese cultural heritage. As a result, now today, I think my Indian friend has once told me the real capital of Chinese culture is Taiwan, not Peking. So it is pity, and not only just a pity, but as a result of damaging or lost your rich cultural heritage, now a lot of corruptions, isn't it? Although corruption is, I think, everywhere. I think in Australia also, I think corruption must be there. Everywhere, isn't it? But you see, comparatively, in those totalitarian regimes, no free information, no press info, because of freedom, so very difficult. Once you have power, you are above the law. That's the problem. So therefore, as a result, I think now China, I think the very basis of the society is family, because of the family value that destroyed. So here, Confucianism, as well as Buddhism, I think can help to rebuild meaningful society. So we very much sort of happy, eager, and our moral responsibility helping Chinese community, because Buddhism is not alien to the Chinese people. And the Europeans, Buddhism is traditionally not your religion. So I always say, telling audience, Europeans, American, or Englishmen, or the Australian who come from Europe, who come from some other countries, I mean, those non-Buddhist countries, your tradition is not Buddhist, not Buddhism. So better to keep your own tradition, not show excitement about Buddhism. No, better to keep your own tradition. But for Chinese,
for Taiwanese, for Vietnamese, for Korean, for Japanese, for Mongolian, for Tibetan, or Laotian, or Cambodian. Oh, of course. Once, this area is once or was there, I don't know. Oh, in any way, this area, traditionally Buddhist country. So, propagating Buddhism is simply reviving by the way, or recognize your own traditional value. So we are very much willing to help you. So as far as the Taiwanese is concerned, every year, annually, few hundred Taiwanese came to Dharamsala and receiving Buddhist explanation or teaching. And also, you see, I think 7 and 9, 97, I visit Taiwan, first time. There are many Buddhists. They are very, very eager to listen about Buddhist explanation. So at that time, I decide every second year, every other year, every other year, I plan to visit Taiwan. Purely non-political, of course. At my first visit to Taiwan, I met some DBB politicians there. I told them, as far as Tibet is concerned, we are not seeking independence. Then you Taiwanese, economically, defense, you have to some unique close relation with mainland China. I told them. So that's my position. Of course, if the people, majority of the people wish independence, that's up to them. But practical level, practical reason, I feel better to have very close unique relation with mainland China. So I told them there. But, however, our Peking boss very much concerned about my visit to Taiwan. So they put condition, I should not go to Taiwan. And my second visit Taiwan, I publicly express, I wish one official from Taiwan should accompany with me while I remain in here, whether I engage some sabotage work or not, spiritist activities or not. So I publicly addressed, one official from Peking should accompany with me day and night what Dalai Lama is doing. They should check. I expressed publicly. Since then, we developed direct contact with the Chinese government, as I mentioned earlier, since 2000. 2001 or 2000? 2001. So, for the time being, I have to say my Taiwanese friends or Taiwanese devotees, for the time being, say bye-bye. So still, I never forget our Taiwanese Buddhist brothers and sisters. It is my moral responsibility to help them, to serve them. So sooner, I think the Chinese, our boss in Peking, may understand that. So then I will have another occasion to visit Taiwan. Purely spiritual matter, like that. So basically, you see, I always happy and feel, as my duty to serve our Buddhist brothers and sisters, particularly Chinese Buddhist brothers and sisters. This I really see. So the another field, I have heavily engaged with modern scientists. Dialogue between Buddhist science and Western science. now more than 20 years, now the discussion really become very, very interesting. So as a result, both sides now enthusiasm now increasing. Among the scientists also now very, very eager to learn Buddhist explanation about different emotions, about mind, about mental functions, like that. So I wish some professors, some scholars from mainland China to participate that meeting, that sort of dialogue, our official, what call, kasa, kasa, life, kasa, ka. Mind, oh, a mind and life, so dialogue. So it's going very well. So to those concerned people, since many years, I express now some scientists, some scholars from traditionally Buddhist country should be participate.
Your Holiness, we're running out of time. We should have finished a few minutes ago. I wonder, would you like to take another question, or would you like to make some closing remarks?
No, I think nothing left. Finished.
You're happy to take another question? No.
So, very good. Thank you very much. Oh, not there on there. Okay, like that. Tibetan tradition.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want it. This is from the local Tibetan site. Now from my side also. Now here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, this tradition, using scarf, I think it seems to come from Indian tradition. Whenever you visit some sort of temple or something, as a host, usually gives you shawl, in India. I think that's the original sort of kasoda, original. Then, and also I think the Indian tradition, they usually say something you should put in their head. So that part gives you is something sign of respect, I think. So the tradition comes from India. Then this practice by Tibetan, not Chinese. But this material made in China. Under Tibetan order, so therefore here is a Tibetan written, Tibetan script. The meaning of the script is the person who wear this day and night should be happy. So this I really feel symbol of harmony. Tradition come from India, practiced by Tibetan, material made in China. United. Thank you. That's right. Thank you. I really enjoy our sort of conversation. I do. Hopefully, the audience also, I think, enjoy. Thank you. I really appreciate all our supporters and also the concerned sort of professors and also the, I think, institution here. I really appreciate. And certainly, I want to express my, deep appreciation, thank to our supporters. I consider those people, individual, as well as organization who are helping us is not pro-Tibetan, but pro-justice. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. 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 Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for your attendance today, and please join me in thanking the organisers of today's event, the Australia-Tibet Council and the Kasten Centre for Human Rights at Monash University. Thank you very much. Dr. Keith Suter is probably already well known to many of you as a social and political commentator. His first doctorate was on the international law of guerrilla warfare, and his second doctorate, some people have more than one, on the economic and social consequences of the arms race. Dr. Suter has been a member of the Club of Rome, the global think tank on environmental and economic matters, since 1991. He's a consultant on social policy at the Wesley Mission in Sydney, President of the New South Wales branch of the United Nations Association of Australia, and President of the Sydney chapter of the Society for International Development. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Suter to speak to us about the new era of warfare.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my job this afternoon is to set the broader context for where we're up to in terms of the long struggle for peace. I want to make 3 points. One, I want to look at the good news relating to warfare. Secondly, I want to give some of the bad news. And then thirdly, to look at what I call the triangle of peace, of how we can move forward the global peace process. First of all, the good news. The good news is that war is a dying business. We're coming now to the end of the Cold War era, which was the central defining event for the second half of the 20th century, and there was no World War III. The last time I was, in fact, at Monash was 20 years ago discussing the issue of the World War III. Luckily, we've got away from that risk. Also, it's worth bearing in mind in the broad context that in the 20th century, the majority of people who were killed in war died in the first half of the 20th century. And so we see, therefore, over the decades, that bit by bit, warfare is gradually dying out in terms of the number of people killed. And in fact, some people say that this is what's called the Golden Arches theory of world peace. No two countries that sell McDonald's have gone to war against each other. It's not a reflection of the fact that you eat McDonald's and lose your ability to fight, but in fact, underpinning that is a theory in political science that democracies do not go to war against each other. Nowadays, the nature of citizenship has changed, and citizens no longer expect from governments the delivery of military glory. If you go around Melbourne, you'll see these marvellous statues of the military leaders, for example, like General Gordon near Parliament House. That era is on the way out. If we look for national glory now, we look to sporting personalities to deliver us national glory. Instead, what citizens want in an increasing number of countries is economic progress. We are increasingly consumers, and that has good and bad aspects to it, but certainly in the context of today's presentation, the good news is that people are less and less willing to fight. We have fewer and fewer people killed in warfare. And so we now see, therefore, a new warfare state emerging. The good news is a reduction in the total number of international wars, a reduction in the total number of people being killed in wars. And we're moving away from that era of the mass slaughter that we saw in World Wars I and II. And instead we see the importance, if you like, of international trade drawing countries together. For example, look at France and Germany. For 1,000 years, the Franks and the Huns, more recently the French and the Germans, have fought each other. On 2 occasions last century, they involved people from Victoria. Now it is inconceivable that France and Germany would ever go to war with each other. Why kill those people? They're our customers. And so we see therefore that trade knits the world together. And although there are some transnational corporations that make money out of war, most of them prefer to have peace, because that's how you can then sell your products and your services, you can have people travelling overseas, etc. So we see, therefore, the importance of trade in knitting the world together, the importance of democracy, that don't go to war against each other, and overall a reduction in international conflict. So my first point is that war is a dying business. The bad news is the rise of what I call the warfare state. Warfare is now increasingly internal, not international. It is guerrilla, not conventional. And so we're seeing, therefore, wars are now much more difficult to fight because of the way in which we no longer have those clear battlefronts. The soldiers no longer wearing their uniforms and carrying their arms openly. Warfare is a lot more messy than it has been in previous eras. Meanwhile, we also have a growing gap between the rich and the poor. And for the first time in history, people now know they are poor. In previous eras, they would have been born in poverty, raised in poverty, died in poverty, because they would have known no other way of life. Now, people have access to radio and television programs. And so they can see, if you're living in a squalid slum somewhere, how people can live in Australia. You watch Sylvania Waters. You know how Americans live. You watch Dallas. We don't take those programs seriously, but others do. And there is a growing resentment at the growing gap between the rich and the poor in many societies. In previous eras, people probably would have supported communist individuals promising revolution and a utopia. Now, sometimes they're inclined to support extremist religious leaders. So we're seeing, therefore, a change in the nature of warfare. The old ideas relating to warfare, large conventional forces, large bombing raids, those ideas don't work. Increasingly, you're having to win the hearts and minds of people, and that's a much more difficult task. So my second point is simply to identify that there is some bad news in the way in which the new era of warfare is more complicated. Fewer people being killed, but wars being much more complicated to deal with. Now, of course, there are some people who will say, well, what about the risk of terrorism? And I agree, there is a real problem with terrorism. It's a form of, if you like, guerrilla warfare. But you've got to keep the terrorist threat in perspective. The total number of people who were killed on 9/11 came to about 3,000, including about 21 Australians and New Zealanders. So 3,000 people killed on 9/11 in the United States. But 5,000 Americans die each year through food poisoning. Last year, more Americans died in their bath than the total number of people killed by terrorism worldwide. So you need to keep in perspective the number of people who can be killed in terrorist attacks. And of course, in a broader context, 30,000 Americans die through guns each year, either murder or suicide. 10 times the number of Americans and others killed on 9/11. The Northern Ireland conflict has run now for about 30 years, and it may well be that it's drawing to a close now. With the exception of 1972, more people were killed on the roads of Northern Ireland than killed in the violence. But you would never get that impression from the media, because the media obviously focus so much on people being killed through acts of terrorism and violence in Northern Ireland. So, in summary, yes, terrorism is a problem. Yes, it is part of this new complexity of warfare. But let us keep in perspective the total threat of terrorism. You still are safer flying than driving out to a university campus. Keep the threat of terrorism in perspective. So what I've tried to do then this afternoon, one, is to give you an overview of the good news relating to the declining number of people being killed in conflicts, the way in which trade is now knitting the world together, and the way in which democracies don't go to war against each other. The other side, the bad news, the new warfare state of guerrilla warfare, of terrorism, etc., a new complicated era of warfare. Let me just conclude with what I call the triangle of peace. Basically, there seem to me to be three ways in which simultaneously we have to work for peace. First of all, there is disarmament. So we have to work through United Nations and bilateral bodies for nuclear disarmament, chemical, biological disarmament, and also the total reduction in small arms. Small arms, by the way, are the weapons of mass destruction. Each day people are being killed with small arms in localised conflicts around the world. As I say, you've got many people who are alienated through their poverty. We are militarising despair. They are using those small arms. Indeed, it's worth bearing in mind that a Kalashnikov rifle in Eastern Africa is as cheap as the price of a chicken. Weapons are one of humankind's most durable and most sustainable inventions. They have a long life. So on the one side, we have to work for disarmament, getting rid of the weaponry. Nuclear weapons, which, by the way, are actually slowly being reduced. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, largely not used at all now in warfare, as well as getting rid of small arms. That's one side of the triangle. A second side of the triangle is conflict resolution, the peaceful settlement of international disputes. Too often we write the histories as though they were biographies of generals and battles. But there is also a story of peace which doesn't get adequate recognition. There is all sorts of progress being made in the peaceful settlement of international disputes. The standard test that I give when I'm speaking on this subject is to say we have had two sets of disagreements over islands in the South Atlantic. And when I ask audiences what were those disagreements, everybody can guess the Falklands/Malvinas dispute, 25 years ago almost exactly, between Argentina and Great Britain. Everybody knows that war because we publicise wars. But there is another set of islands over which there's been an even longer dispute. And it's interesting to note that during the war in 1982 between Great Britain and Argentina, Chile supported Britain. Why? Because Chile expected to be invaded, not the Falklands. They have a dispute with Argentina called over Tierra del Fuego, the end of the world. 500 years ago, when the Pope divided the world between the two superpowers of his day, Spain and Portugal, it was very unclear as to where his quill pen went through the bottom of Latin America. So for 500 years, Spain and Portugal, Chile and Argentina have quarrelled over Tierra del Fuego. In 1982, with the war between Britain and Argentina over the Falkland Islands, the previous Pope, the one who passed away recently, decided to send in a team of negotiators to deal with the other dispute created by his predecessor almost half a millennium earlier. And they settled the negotiations. No fuss, no war, a peace treaty was signed. This was such great news that some of us encouraged the Australian Foreign Minister at the time, Bill Hayden, who's an atheist, to issue a statement congratulating the Pope. We thought that might be newsworthy. Again, no publicity. Quite coincidentally, I was in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a decade on exactly to the signing of that peace treaty, and not even in Argentina did they publicise that peace treaty. Instead, they were concentrating on their dispute over the Falkland Islands, Malvinas. The tragedy in history is that people grow up assuming that war is an inevitable and natural way to solve their disputes. We know that is not the case. Some years ago, the Seville Statement on Violence was drawn up, which argued that warfare is not a natural human activity. People need to be trained to do it. Many people, I'm sure, in this room have never been directly involved in fighting a war, and pretty well most people in this room have never actually killed anybody else in a war. And don't blame it on your animals. You know, say, oh, we inherited warfare from our animals. That's insulting to the animals. They don't want to be compared with human beings. No animal fights warfare. It's a human-made invention. If humans have invented it, humans can also disinvent it and forego it, in much the same way as we've now stopped duelling between peoples. You know, if you think back 200 years ago, an American vice president was involved in a duel. We've now stopped duelling. If we can change the behaviour at the individual level, surely we can also change the nature of warfare to give more attention to the peaceful settlement of international disputes. So the second side of that triangle is conflict resolution. The peaceful settlement of international disputes and domestic disputes and other disputes. So you get rid of weaponry, but you also create another way of settling disputes. And then thirdly, the base of the triangle is the struggle for justice. The tree of peace has its roots in justice. We therefore need to give attention to economic justice, human rights, the environment, social development, conversion of military facilities to civilian use. My second doctorate, as you've heard, is on the economic cost of the arms race. As part of my doctoral research, I had to try to work out how I would spend the current high level of international expenditure on economic and social development. You know, you can get clean water and sanitation in Africa in 80 days. And I'm talking about year after year of military expenditure. The tragedy is that we can find money for war, we can't find it for peace. And yet the answers to many of our problems are within our own grasp, because the money is there if we can convert all that high level of military facilities to civilian use. It's interesting to note that the annual budget of the International Committee of the Red Cross is less than 1 week's expenditure by the Americans in the current Iraq conflict. We can find money for war, we can't find it for peace. So to summarise, what I've tried to argue, therefore, is that war is a dying business, and we're gradually seeing a reduction in the total number of people being killed in war. Secondly, however, we're seeing a new warfare state emerging, which is involving internal fighting of a guerrilla nature. I've argued that the long search for peace means that we have to proceed along three sides of a triangle simultaneously. Negotiating disarmament to get rid of the existing weapons. Secondly, to find alternative ways of settling disputes. And there are many techniques already there, it's just that we're not publicising them. It's interesting to note that when the Iran crisis involving the Carter administration got underway, the Carter administration in 1979-1980 sent in a group of Americans to try to rescue the diplomats trapped in Tehran, where they were to stay for 444 days. That raid by the US military failed. President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his memoirs says, now that the military option had failed, we had no choice but to negotiate. And Libya and the Bank of England worked together to sort out that dispute and liberate those Americans. But isn't it a tragedy that we get round to negotiating only after the violence has not worked, rather than making recourse to war a first way. We've got to give peace a chance. So by way of conclusion, let me just make 2 comments. First of all, I agree there is a problem with terrorism, but I do urge people to live by their hopes and not their fears. That we need to live in an era when we are inspired to do better and to expect more. Let's not focus on the negative all the time. My colleague on another radio station in Sydney, with whom I debate every Monday for an hour, is someone who lives by his fears. And sure enough, everything in his life seems to go wrong. I live by my hopes and I have a much easier way of living. So be optimistic about the world. And finally, there is a Jewish saying that the strongest person in the world is the person who can make their enemy their friend. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Keith Suter. And Keith, just before we move on, I want to ask you if you could tell us how you think then this changing world that you've described, this decline of warfare, which I'm sure we would all welcome, how would you relate that to the situation in Tibet and Tibet's relationship with China? Do you have any thoughts about focusing from that global down to the specifics in China and Tibet?
I think that, well, I've had to avoid deliberately Tibet because I'm not sure what His Holiness is going to say, and I had to make sure I didn't say anything that was later going to be inadvertently contradicted by His Holiness when he eventually arrives on the campus. But let me just say that one of the significant developments is the fact that China is now becoming part of the international community. And so China now has a vested interest in being seen to be modern and to be attractive to foreign investment, to foreign customers. And so it is actually now within China's own interest, therefore, to find that they are more open to the world and be open more to negotiations. My feeling is that at the moment, the people struggling for settling the dispute over Tibet have a better window of opportunity now than they would have had in previous eras when the Chinese were caught up in a Cold War between the United States and China, and that in fact it was very fashionable to be hostile to China. China now has a dilemma. On the one hand, it wants to open up to the international world. It may, of course, still want to hold on to Tibet, but you can imagine there'd be some people in China saying, look, let's just get the Tibet thing settled once and for all because we've got a world out there of customers. We in Australia are attracted by the proposition of 1.4 billion customers, but they're looking out at the world and saying there's a world of 6 billion customers out there. Let's drop all of these political liabilities and clearly the struggle that Tibet has attracted by way of its high profile, the sympathy that's engendered around the world, means therefore that from the Chinese point of view, it is a pebble in the shoe. Do you remember the person who used that expression before? It was Ali Alatas, the Indonesian foreign minister, describing East Timor. That whenever, as long as the Indonesians had occupied East Timor, people kept saying, we're not going to discuss other things with Indonesia until you do something about East Timor. I think there must be people in China who are saying, look, that's a pebble in our shoe. We're trying to open up, be more friendly, get more foreign investment, and people just want to talk about Tibet. That's the pebble in the shoe. Is there a way, therefore, from a Chinese point of view, of reducing this problem of the pebble in the shoe? Let's settle Tibet in a way that brings about a degree of stability and improves our image. That way, things are broader and more open for us to engage with the world. So there is a window of opportunity, I think, which is emerging now, which we've not had before, and that's actually, for me, a good aspect of globalisation, the way that trade across national boundaries is becoming so increasingly important.
So you continue to put the hopes above the fears?
Absolutely. Focus on the hopes.
Because, I mean, you said that in relation to terrorism, but the response would be the reason we haven't had more September 11th is because of the response to that in terms of a much bigger focus on security, a much more protective state, and some would say wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Absolutely. Well, there is, you do have real problems here. I don't want to minimise it. I don't want to sound like Pollyanna to be focusing on the good news without acknowledging the bad news that is there. The worry I've got is that we in the media, and of course I work for a different media outlet, we in the media do tend to focus very much on the negative. There are many positive issues out there which are not getting adequate enough publicity. And I do think, Peter, that we've got to find ways of making sure we give equal opportunity for peace. We give a lot of opportunity for war stories, but there are some good news about peace that's emerging.
Oh, the media are always to blame. I think that we take the rap over and over again for. And I have to say, it is harder to write a story about peace than it is to write a story about war. It's a less dramatic event.
Yeah.
Now, let me just check on the progress of the Dalai Lama and how we're going. I think that he's still a few moments away. Keith, what do you see as the role of development in this, the role of economic well-being in questions of war and peace?
I think that one of the things we need to work towards, also linked to this, is the whole question of needing, if you're going to have economic development, which I support, we've also got to have sustainable economic development. That must be another, and there's a concern that I've got with the stories that are coming out about Tibet and about some of the developments that are underway there. We need to be very careful that it's not economic development at all costs, that we need to make sure that there is equal attention being given to the environment. I also need to say that economic development alone won't settle our problems. Money is good, but it's not going to solve all of the world's problems. It's interesting to note that, going back to the 9/11 terrorism attack, that of the 19 hijackers, 15 were from Saudi Arabia, none, by the way, from Afghanistan. 15 from Saudi Arabia. All of those young men were guaranteed a lifetime pension from the government. Because if you're part of the wealthy Saudi elite, you don't have to work for a living. And what is interesting is that they were not obviously motivated by money. Now, I have focused on part of the attention on the need for economic justice, and I stand by that. But we also need to recognise that money alone won't solve issues. It will not reduce some of the anger that people feel in their hearts. Those 15 Saudi hijackers, obviously, despite their high level of income, had within them no reason to live. And Osama bin Laden could give them a reason to die. And I think that's an issue that we need to bear in mind. Obviously, economic development is important, but it's not going to be the sole way of solving the violence in this world. So I support conversion of military facilities to civilian use. I'm obviously in favour of economic development, all of those things. But you've also got to bear in mind it's not going to be enough. There is a spiritual need in people that also needs to be addressed and isn't going to be solved simply by military issues and conversion of military facilities to civilian use and economic development, or even protecting the environment. You've got a deeper spiritual quest that obviously goes on and was going on the hearts of these 15 young men from Saudi Arabia. They needed a reason to live, they couldn't get that, but Osama did give them a reason to die. And I think that's a bit of a warning for us, that economic development is fine, but you've also got to address deeper needs that people feel.